You are listening to 10,000 Swamp Leaders, leadership conversations that explore adapting and thriving in a complex world with Rick Torsett and guests.
Hi, everybody. This is Rick Torsett, and this is 10,000 Swamp Leaders. This is the podcast where we have conversations with individuals who, in some way, shape, or form, have made a decision to use themselves to lead change, have impact in the world on things that matter to them. Today is different than most of my other episodes, Jeff, because I have you back for part 2 of a conversation we started last week. So Jeff Mead is back to return and speak to narrative leadership. So first of all, Jeff, let's just get you back on the board here. So welcome back to the swamp.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be back.
Okay. So I'm going to turn this little piece of work over to you. One of the things we want to discuss is right out of the gate is to help people understand the distinction between narrative identity and narrative leadership and why you position them in this order. We also gave them a little task if they listened to the first episode that they might do between then and now. So why don't I throw it over to you and you go from there?
Surely. So if you like, narrative identity is around the stories that shape us. And narrative leadership, one might say, is the stories that we're seeking to shape in the world, in our practice, in our organizations, in our societies. And narrative identity, a sense of who we are, is fundamental to how we go about trying to shape other stories. So there's an intimate relation. I talk about narrative leadership today, and you'll have sort of 3 main elements. The first of which is knowing yourself. And that's so fundamental and so important that it felt worthwhile spending a whole session on that area before we entered into the broader sphere of narrative leadership. You'll recall that the invitation that we gave our listeners was to think back to a time when they first were aware of themselves as leaders or leading, and suggested that may well be when they were kids, maybe younger than 16. And if they had the chance to tell that moment, the story of that moment to a colleague, or at least to jot down some thoughts about it, but to reflect perhaps on what qualities and values were present at that time. And what were the qualities that the young leader was evincing, was showing at that stage? What values were they trying to uphold in that moment? And they may well be tacit and embedded in the story. But it's fascinating to see how much weight those have. I've done this often with leaders in senior roles, and very often they reconnect with a more, if you like, a more innocent sense of self, a more untutored sense of self, a more natural sense of self, of what really matters before the world taught them something that it didn't matter. And it can be very powerful to do that. If our listeners have had the chance to do that, or go back and do that, they'll then have something really tangible against which to kind of test the various propositions and ideas that we're sharing today.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. So let's begin like we did last week. Last week, you brought a quote by Salman Rushdie that sort of launched this into the conversation. Again, you brought a quote here that is relevant to the exploration of narrative leadership. So why don't you go ahead with that, and then we'll get on with it.
Yeah, so it's from Ben Okri, who's a British-born novelist with a Nigerian family background, and he won the Booker Prize for The Famished Road some years ago. He's a great writer of novels, but also a great thinker and writer about story and storytelling. I've had the pleasure of meeting him and talking with him, and he was the patron of the School of Storytelling, of which I was once a trustee. And he says, amongst the many wise things he says about stories, is this: stories are the secret reservoir of values. Change the stories individuals or nations live by, and you change the individuals and nations themselves. And he's not saying for the better or for the worse. It could be either, as we can see in the world around us. We pays our penny and we makes our choice. But he points to something really fundamental, which is that it's the stories we carry that shape our behavior and the actions and decisions in the world, which I think is really where the power of narrative leadership comes from, and the need to understand it.
Yeah. When you sent me this quote the other day as we were prepping, I read it and I thought it was great. And then I found myself later on thinking a little bit more about it and realizing how easy it is to miss the subtlety of the potential an individual can have as impact, as you say, either for the good or for not so good, through a conscious decision to think about their stories and craft stories that may be beneficial to the thing. I mean, there's really a lot of agency in what he's advocating there. At least it struck me as that. So I don't know if you agree with that or not.
There is, but he's also noticed he's saying not just the stories we tell, but the stories we live by.
Yeah.
And if we're trying to change the stories we live by, then we need to change the stories. So we have to understand where they come from and be able to change them, which goes back a little bit to the Salman Rushdie quote about, those who are unable to change their story are helpless, they're stuck.
Yeah. Okay. Before we get into this specifics of the narrative leadership, let's help people understand this distinction between leadership and leading, because you and I have discussed this online and offline. So sharpen that perspective, because it's an important distinction to have going into this work we're going to have.
Yeah, I think it is. So as I probably mentioned last time, I've been around the leadership development field for a long time. And it's taken me many years to realize that I'm really not very interested in leadership. It's an abstract noun. It doesn't mean very much in itself. We can load it with whatever we want to put into it. It's like an empty suitcase that we can fill. And also, it's a way in which, by making it abstract, we can not be responsible for it. I've worked in a number of organizations where they talk about the leadership. These are people around the organization. But it also is a way of saying, this is not my problem. It's the leadership leads. And I think it's very problematic. And it's also rather disempowering. And I found that it's much more helpful and healthy to think of leading. What is it we do when we lead? If we think of leading as a verb, as an activity, then we can get some more agency, to use a word I used last time, over how we engage with it. And it both democratizes the process because it doesn't restrict it to a group of leaders. And it actually challenges us to take responsibility, wherever we are, and whoever we are in an organization. We can, in a moment, if a particular time, a particular circumstance, we can seek to lead, to influence, to change the course of opinion, change the course of action as things go forward. In that sense, although I'm a great fan of Keith Grint, and I've taught alongside him a number of times, I rather disagree with his sense that this is about leaders and followers, because that puts people into different categories. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. Of course, some people have a nominal leadership role. You can't get away from using the word as a figure of speech. Some people have a responsibility to lead, and it's nominal in their job title. But we can all lead and we can all follow. And you can follow as the chief executive, you can follow, and it may be appropriate for you to do so.
From time to time, yeah. And I want to amplify, at least I'll throw my perspective in here, and you're saying this, but just to sort of be more specific, I think leading is a choice, and sometimes we choose it and sometimes we don't, I think. And therefore it can come from, as you just said, anywhere in the system by anybody raising their hand and choosing to do it with, I would say, an understanding, hopefully, that you can get hurt. It could be challenging. It's not risk-free when you make that choice. It comes with some
No, of course not.
Possible peril. All right. So you have a point of view, a definition of leadership you shared with me offline. I wonder if you'd share it with me here with the audience, because I think it gives a good perspective of where we're headed here.
Well, I would call it an element of leading rather than a definition of leadership. So it's one that I've tested often with people in workshops and in organizations, that I say, what are we doing when we're leading? And my proposition is that perhaps at the core, but certainly a very important part of it, is we are making sense of complex and difficult situations and circumstances with and sometimes for other people. So in that sense, leading is an ongoing mutual process of meaning making, if you like, socially constructed meaning, if you want to be philosophical about it or ontological about it. And it's a relational process that we continue to do. So, and I virtually had unanimous agreement. People say, yeah, that is it. I do that. That is what I do. Part of what I do as a leader or when I'm leading is I'm taking a situation and trying to make sense of it with people and for people. And often it's about the future. It's about what might happen or what we might like to happen. And I think that's people have found that a very empowering way of thinking about leading. And it's not exclusive. There are other things. Of course, there are other things to do with leading. But that's the point of entry, I think, for narrative leadership, because narrative and story is an extremely powerful way of making meaning and making sense.
In complex situations in particular, where there is probably no one person in the room that knows the answer to the challenge.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I say, and we perhaps get onto this, I don't know if now's the moment, but there's a way in which we need to understand what it is, what's the bit that story and narrative does that enables us to make sense of things, because it's not our only sense-making tool. Of course it isn't. And it's not the only way we have of communicating. I talk about a very simple model of communication, which is about information, argument, and story. And they do different things. and understanding what the difference is and when to use them and how to use them in concert, I think is very powerful.
Well, let's get onto it right here. I mean, you're bringing it up. So because I think this is a building block that some of the other stuff we'll talk about, at least partnership with. So draw out some elements of those distinctions you're making, if you would.
Yeah, to make this distinction. Well, we could talk about it, but why don't we do something? I think we'll run a little practice that I often do, which is a sort of going back to the fundamentals of what story does. So I often get people in a room and I ask them in pairs to tell each other all the good reasons why it's a good thing to travel by train. And they do that. And they list them and they listen. They soon run out of steam, actually. After about 90 seconds, they run out of steam normally. And then I start them in a different modality. I say, can you remember a memorably enjoyable train story? A time when you had a train journey that any time in your life was memorably enjoyable. Some people look askance because they hate trains. And I say, that's fine. Think of a memorably awful train journey, but think of one journey. And I get them to tell the story of that train journey to each other. And they're very different experiences. So why don't you challenge me to do that and you can see what the difference is.
Yeah. So tell me all the good reasons. You're an Englishman, so you got train experience.
Yeah, we have trains. Yeah.
So what's the benefits of trains? What's the good things that trains do?
Okay. Well, in no particular order, I would say on a good train journey, you can relax and have a meal as you go. You can have a serious conversation. You can read and write on a train. You can sleep on a train. It's better for the environment. It's cheaper, less emissions per mile per person. There isn't the hassle of having somewhere to park. You can relax because you're not responsible all the time for where you're going and what you're doing. You may go somewhere where you can really take in the view, which you can't do when you're driving. You could have a meeting on a train. You might meet someone interesting on a train. You're not going to do that driving a car, or you may be in an airplane because it's more social. What else can I think of? You can plan ahead. You can plan your journey. You know when it's going to be. You're more likely, when the train service is running well, you know when it's going to start, when it's going to stop. You're not subject to the vagaries of the motorways clogging up. It's safer. How about that? They're the reasons I can think at the moment.
Yeah, and most of those in the United States, you can't pull off on a train. So
yes, I did once ask a room full of senior executives from an American organization to think of a memorable train journey, and I was faced by the fact that they said, we don't do trains. So we talked about road trips instead.
Yeah, so take us on a memorable train trip that you've been on.
All right. And I love trains, I should say. My grandfather was an engine driver in the days of steam, so it's in my blood. But I can certainly remember one wonderful journey that I took with my late wife. We went under the Channel Tunnel. We drove a car, and I have a little open two-seater car, and I just got it, and we were going to take it on a trip up the Pyrenees. So we got on the motorrail in Calais in the evening. We'd been to a hypermarket, and we bought some wine and peaches and meat and cheese and French bread. The car was put onto the motorrail. We found our cabin, our couchette, and as the evening kind of grew darker, we had our meal. We were kind of sensing and tasting what was to come. And then we put the bunks up, and she being younger than me, she climbed up to the top bunk. I slept in the lower bunk, and it had a wonderful sensation of rattling through the night, rocking and rattling and rocking and rattling. And these night trains, they don't go fast, they go slow because they stop at stations to deliver mail, to pick up packages. So every so often during the night, it would come to a stop, and we'd wake up, and Chris would put her hand down from the top, and I'd reach up and we'd just touch hands, and then soon we'd be asleep. And when it got to morning, by that time we'd travel right through France down to a town called Narbonne, which is near the south coast. And we got out, and we had to wait for the cars to be unloaded. And as we waited, it was very hot. There was a very elderly couple waiting in the heat, and I thought, my goodness, he didn't have much hair to protect his head. So I lent him my hat, and we had a little chat. And they were very upper crust. And, oh yes, we come here every year. And as we waited, their vintage Rolls Royce was wheeled off the train for them. And they got in. I mean, I don't know that he'd ever had any other car. He looked like he was the same vintage as the car. And I remember Chris and I turning to each other as this delightful couple kind of pootled away into the distance, saying, maybe one day that could be us.
And okay, so for the listeners, I can see the distinctions you're making here between the didactic, descriptive nature, the bullet point list of values of taking a train, and the narrative, sort of the song line, and almost a kind of evocative music that goes with it.
So I'm imagining that in relation to the former, you were kind of nodding internally saying, yeah, no, maybe that's probably right. We judge that sort of communication. We run it past our critical thinking faculty, and we should. But the story communication, we say it differently, we receive it differently. So I'm saying, I'm taking a gamble here, and I'm saying there's a very good chance that as I was talking, you were able to imagine some of those scenes. You were able to see, maybe hear, maybe even taste the wine in a sense. So a story has this amazing capacity to create a vicarious experience of something in a different way. It is very personal. Anyone pretty much could have told you the list of good reasons. Only I could have told that story. It's very personal. You learn more about me in my life from the telling of the story. Even what I didn't say, you got a glimpse into me. And I think it's a truism that when we communicate in that more abstract, generalized way, we always somehow say less than we mean. And when we tell a story, we always say more than we know. There's a way in which with a story, we are revealing something of ourselves. We're showing up differently. Even a simple personal story like that can be very powerful in making connection. And there's things like memorability. You know, the form of the first communication is not innately memorable. So I will wager you that you, in a week's time, maybe even this afternoon, won't remember that list.
Not many of them.
No, but I'll wager you that probably even in a week's time, you might think, oh, that journey. So there's something about the form. It's innately memorable. It has the capacity to stimulate images, which is imagination. That's what imagination is. And it's a kind of vicarious experience of living through senses that our body hasn't known, but our brain kind of reproduces as if they had. We get that. And the other thing it does is open up, I'm suggesting to you, the emotional bandwidth of a story is wider than the emotional bandwidth of that more formal communication. So I'm guessing you had a different emotional response to the story than you had to the other.
Very much so.
Yeah. We have there kind of three elements of communication that I work with: information, argument, and story. And they're different. You know, information informs, it purports to give the facts of something. And as I say, we run it past our critical thinking. Of course we do. We need to. The numbers need to add up. We make an argument, the logic of something. If this, then that. And again, we check it out. Do we agree? Was that actually a correct logical presumption? Did it follow? Was it a correct deduction? Or are there different axioms, or are there other possibilities? Yep, no, maybe. Story doesn't do that. You were judging my story by different criteria. Was it interesting? Was it lifelike? Did it engage me? And so what stories do, not uniquely, but in a particularly strong way, is they stimulate the imagination and they open up the emotional bandwidth. And I think in terms of communicating, whether it's as part of our role in leading or anywhere else, if we want to be really effective in communicating, then we need to understand how those three work together.
Yeah, it's just the question I was going to ask you. So say something about, two things I think I want to ask you about that. One is about the integration of those three elements. And maybe before that, if I'm in a position where I'm going to be having to speak, how do I think about the design of the integration of that? Is there a sequence, or how do you get at that? So when you got a thing to come into the room with that does address it from those three angles?
Well, it doesn't always have to.
Okay.
I mean, imagine a slightly different train scenario. Imagine that you're in your car driving to the station and you don't know where the car park is, and I'm walking along the road. And you pull up beside me and you say, excuse me, can you tell me where the car park is for the train station? Well, if I turn around to you and say, do you know, it's extraordinary you should say that. My grandfather was an engine driver in the days of steam, and he used to take me down the sidings when I was a boy, and we'd look at the steam rise. You don't need or want a story. You want information, and you want it now. So information and argument are very concise and quick. We can convey a lot of information. So the question is, when do we need a story? Well, what do stories do? They create this vicarious experience. And if we get a sense of when information and argument are not enough, when we try to communicate something and our audience kind of understands what we're saying, but they don't get it. You know what I mean? They don't actually get it. Hasn't landed somehow. They can't quite understand what this is all about. So that's the time when a story is really helpful. An example, you can call it an example of something that has happened or might yet happen, in order to give people a different kind of connection with it. And they can say, oh, it's like that. Doesn't mean I have to agree with you. But if they can't get a sense of, oh, it's like that, you haven't got the basis for a holistic conversation about it. You can just say, well, that's logical, but that doesn't buy me in or give me the chance to decide whether or not I want to buy in, not with anything other than my head.
Yeah. So is it that part when you're choosing to lead and you're trying to bring people along on some initiative, is it that part that is causing them to follow and come and engage? Or does it get backed up a little? It's backed up with some of the other parts.
It's all three. As I say, the numbers have to add up. If they don't, what's the point? If the logic of what you're saying doesn't make sense, I'm not interested in the story. So you have to, your foundations have to be there. But it's that bit of communicating a sense of what this actually might be. I think I may have mentioned last time this notion of storytelling having an evolutionary advantage. We are the storytelling animal. Noah Yuval Harari, in his wonderful book *Sapiens*, talks about how perhaps it gave us as a species an evolutionary advantage. The fact that we could sit down on the campfire and say, this morning I was at the waterhole and there was some mammoth there and one looked like it was ready to have a calf, and I think we could catch that tomorrow. The evolutionary advantage of being able to do that, as opposed to having to grab everyone by the hand, take them to the waterhole and point, is enormous. We're actually creating an experience of something that isn't present. And our minds, our brains, and we're discovering this through neuroscience in the last decade, the idea of a mirror neuron, that our brains react to a story or seeing something like a film or a play as if we were there. Not fully. The pattern of neuronal activity is very similar in the brain when we're listening to a story or reading a story or going to a play or cinema or something like that, as if we're actually doing it. We know it's not real, but it is real in a way.
It is real, yeah.
We have an experience. We have a vicarious sensory experience of something. And then we're in a different position to make up our minds about it. And then we can have a different kind of conversation, which I think is where storytelling as part of narrative leadership fits in. It is, of course, not the only element of narrative leadership. And storytelling, that element, it is a skill, it is a craft. We already innately have a huge amount of tacit knowledge about what it is to tell stories. We do it all the time. But from the craft of storytelling, there are a few key things that people can learn about repertoire composition and performance, to talk about it in artistic terms, that can add a great deal to impact. Some simple techniques, if you like, that can add to impact. But our innate capacity is there. You can't instill that. I've never met anyone I couldn't help tell a really good story if they wanted to. I've met a handful over the years who didn't want to. And the reason for that, I think, my judgment on the situation, is that they weren't willing to be vulnerable. Because as we, even in the train story we experienced, there is a certain vulnerability. I've let you into a little bit of my life there, which has very poignant memories for me. So I've met people who don't want to do that. They're not willing to take the armor plate off. And that's a choice. It's not for me to judge. But I've never met anyone who wanted to tell a story who couldn't tell a really good story with a little bit of effort.
Okay. So there's a story I want you to tell in a minute. But before that, I'm interested in getting another element to this end here, because you, in your modest way, believe that Aristotle missed something.
Yes, I do.
But I think it's relevant and it fits here. So say a little bit more about how you can upgrade Aristotle's points of view here.
Aristotle 2.1. So when Aristotle and other classical authors wrote about rhetoric, that is the art of persuasion, the art of influence. They spoke about three elements. One is logos. That's the quality of the argument that is being made. Another was pathos. That's the feelings that you can engender. And the third element is ethos. That's the character and standing of the person who is trying to influence you. Do I believe this person? Do they walk the talk? And I think they're absolutely relevant. But I think he missed out mythos. And mythos for me is connected with the imagination in particular. I've got a pet theory about that, which is I think the classical Greeks externalized in their minds, they externalized imagination from their own psyche. They thought that was a gift. So it wasn't theirs. They were touched by the muse, and that's what happened. But whether that's true or not, I don't know. And who am I really to criticize Aristotle? But I think it makes the point that if we think about communicating simply in terms of argument, feeling, and character. We're not quite there. We've taken a long way, but to engage something, to sort of get the hook that enables people to begin to experience something and see something, we need to engage their imaginations.
It strikes me as you're speaking to this dynamic that great, well, I'm going to say movie makers, but in art shows up everywhere. But movie is such a visual and story aspect that some of those people that we highly regard and almost know by default, if, for example, Steven Spielberg has a new movie coming out, we have a pretty good sense that there'll be all those elements at play as we ride along for 2 hours in the conversation. Writers, et cetera, have this brass. So you probably have more company in thinking Aristotle missed a piece than you think. Might be a small crowd.
I feel safe because he's not going to sue me.
All right, so let's make it real, because you told me a story that I was not aware of about, I'm just going to say the post office story, and you can go from here, because this is a good example of what you're talking about, I think, in the real world.
I think it's an extraordinary example and a real one, the current one in UK. So in the post office, it's not the post office that delivers letters, that's the Royal Mail. The post office are a series of small offices dotted about, and I think there are thousands of them throughout the country, where you go and buy your stamps, or you can put your parcel in, or you can have a money order. There are various things you can do, a lot of different transactions, most of them small scale, financial. An earlier generation would have done some of their banking at the post office, for example. And about 20 odd years ago, Post Office introduced a new computer system called Horizon. And right from the day one, it was problematic. Sub-post masters and mistresses, the people who ran these offices, were reporting strange accounting results on their system, which they had to balance their books every day. And over the course of about a decade, perhaps a bit longer, hundreds of them were prosecuted for fraud. When I say hundreds, I mean nearly 1,000 were prosecuted for fraud on the basis of a faulty accounting system. And it became known. It was known in Parliament. It was known in the public. It was a scandal. A number of these people, a relatively low number of these, 750, I think, who convicted, had their convictions overturned. It been going on so nobody believed them. Everyone was told it's just you. It took years for them to understand that this was a systemic failure. And everyone in the institution was dragging their feet. Everyone agreed it was wrong, but the courts had to have their time. They had to review each case. There had to be a process for looking at compensation. It dragged on and on and on to the point where people were dying before these things were resolved. And about 3 months ago, an independent television production company made, I think, a 3-part series called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. And this guy Bates was one of these people who gathered together other postmasters and mistresses to fight this problem. And the story was told, and the impact of that story was enormous. It was over all the media within a day or two. It was a hot political topic for the first time, having been brushed aside or dusted over for years and years. And within weeks, a bill was drafted, taken to Parliament to quash these convictions en masse, recognizing that the standard process was too slow, was ineffective, and a huge injustice. And they're also doing things to change the way the compensation system is managed. The story did something that all the information that was known about it didn't and couldn't do. I think it's an extraordinary example of the power of narrative. And in this case, a power for the good.
Yeah. So help people who are unfamiliar with the story. What happened in the story, in the 3 parts, that wasn't happening before, that for people to say, okay, this is story happening and producing change? What was that?
Because we saw the characters, we saw the people involved, either represented by actors, of course, but it became real, it became human. This wasn't some abstract thing that we were told about, information and arguments, something else. It was real people represented by actors, really experiencing this suffering. We saw their human stories. There were suicides involved, and this is true. All this were taken from life. Desperate situations where people were bankrupted, and you saw them living through this experience and feeling, and you saw their attempts to have something done. You saw the dissembling, you saw the lies, and you saw the sort of clumsy-footed operation of institutions trying to respond to it. So it became real. And that's what stories do. They make things real. It's one of the many paradoxes of story, that stories are not about making up fanciful things. They're about making things real for us.
All right. I want to pick that up in a minute here, but first, you also make this distinction, or you pick up this distinction from Jürgen Habermas about systems world versus life world. And I think this is a useful storytelling understanding. It's structure.
Yes. And we can kind of see it here in Mr. Bates' thing, where you've got the system world trying to respond to it in particular ways, very formulaic. They've got rules, they've got procedures, they've got positions of power to protect. And then you've got the life world. You've got the real lived experience of the people in the moment. So Habermas is a Dutch sociologist who talks about the system world and the life world. And he says the system world, that the world of institutions and organizations, works from a rational purposive logic. Institutions and systems are created to achieve certain ends, and they are organized to achieve certain ends. And those ends are prescribed, more or less. They may be for profit, they may be for public good, depending on what they're for, but they have certain prescribed ends. And efforts are organized, and we organize our efforts to achieve those goals and ends. But we don't live our lives like that. The life world is lived differently. We live by love, belief, hope, aspiration, community. And Habermas's notion is that in the industrial and post-industrial age, the life world and the system world became disconnected. If you go back before the industrial age, they were deeply integrated. People lived their work and worked their lives. There was a much closer interconnection. But with specialization of labor and mass production, you've got a separation. There was work and home. I do this at work and I come home. We separate our lives. But, says Habermas, the influence of a system world has grown so much that it's completely overwhelming the influence of the life world. And it's almost colonized it to the point where we, if we're not careful, begin to believe that we need to live our lives in the same way. Anyway, I find this distinction helpful to remember, because when I go into boardrooms and the like to work with people, they are operating in the system world. They have roles, responsibilities, targets, goals, performance measures, rewards, all the rest of it that lock them in place. And what I try to do is open what Habermas called a communicative space. I'm trying to open that space up to let the life world in so that they can meet. And I sometimes think that the most important work I do in those particular settings is getting people to tell each other small stories from life, just little things about their lives. Just small stories about, time that they perhaps overcame a difficulty or an obstacle, a moment they remember about going on holiday, anything small and life world. And when they begin to share those stories, and it's very simple, there's no art in it. It's just a simple invitation. The whole tenor of the room shifts. The whole atmosphere shifts. People either let go of the cloak of role or hold it more lightly. They meet for a time at least in a more life world, human to human way. And when that happens, my experience has been that we've opened up the possibility for different kind of conversations about what the organization should be doing. That's the point at which we've been able to talk really seriously about what's the impact of this organization. What should it be? What are you actually here for? What is it to do what you do? What are the consequences of what you do? What do you want to do about that? Because people are there not just as the chief financial officer or the head of HR or the chief exec. They're there as mum, dad, sister, brother, son, daughter, grandparent as well. And so they're more inclined to think much more broadly and to say, actually, if we go on doing what we're doing, what's my kid's life going to be like? So to connect people, everyone can agree in theory with the importance these days of thinking about the environmental consequences, but it gets real very quickly when you start to bring the life world into that space as well.
So that raises another question for me that I had thought about until you described it this way. So you do your work most often in a room with a room full of people. And then along came COVID, and we're no longer in rooms with people. We were on this platform like you and I are using right now, Zoom, to conduct a conversation. And now we have working remote, people not necessarily going back to work. So I'm just curious for your own perspective, what have you seen emerge from that, what is now kind of a structural change in how people work, for the pro and the con of that, given what you're talking about here?
Well, I used to say before COVID, when people asked me, could we do this remotely? I'd say, no, it's impossible. And then you discover whether it's impossible or not, you're going to do it. And so the impossible became possible. And we learned, I think, collectively kind of learned how to communicate at least better than we had done. And, the tricks of the trade, the breakout rooms and all the things we're used to now. And at its best, I think it's possible to communicate pretty effectively. on remotely, but you don't get the quality of person's presence in the same way. I think it's a poor substitute for that. And whenever possible, I try and work face to face, but I do have to work remotely quite often. So we both got better at doing it. And also we can kid ourselves it's as good as, and it isn't. For human connectivity, it just isn't as good.
Okay, so we're bantering the values of.
By the way, I can prove that, because if you came into my house, my dog would come and sniff your trousers and want to give your face a kiss. He looks at you on the screen, you're two-dimensional, he turns away. Why should I bother to try and get to know anyone whose bottom I can't sniff? And that's the trouble with the internet. We don't get to sniff anyone's bottoms, and we don't really get the feel for them as a person in the room.
I think I'll move on from that comment.
Yeah, move on. Yeah. Metaphorically, I'm talking about.
Metaphorically, sure.
Yeah.
We are talking about all the upsides here, and you have a cautionary note about how narrative can be used for
My goodness, yes.
Not good. So talk a little bit about the examples or the cases that come to mind for you when it's been put to poor use.
Well, I think we look around. I mean, where is it very obvious at the moment? It's very obvious in national politics in many countries of the world. What stories are being told? What are we being peddled, and by whom? And on what basis are the stories being told? What relationship do the stories have to some underlying reality? And I think we're in a very complex, difficult situation, because the notion of evidence and criticality is not as widely accepted as it was. We come to the point where some folk, politicians and others, will say this is true because I say it's true, because I believe it to be so, because this is an alternative truth. And I think that's a tragedy for the human race, frankly. But it's a phenomenon perhaps has been accelerated by social media, where we are disconnected, where we're not in the room, where we can say something and that floats freely without any connection with the person. Socrates was illiterate, refused to learn to write. He said, but what's the value of a word if you can't see the man who says it? All we know of Socrates is what Plato wrote. So in those days, it was just even writing something was a disconnection. But now we have the utterance, we have the story, really often not connected to the person. Sometimes it is, of course, you've got the rally and the connection. I'm not saying it's complete, but I think it's accelerated something and made something more possible. So I think this comes with a cautionary note. When I began this work a long time ago, everyone was pretty gung-ho about story, tell the best story wins and all that sort of stuff. But I think we always have had to be careful about what stories are we telling, in whose interest is the story being told. When we hear a story, whether it's an organizational story or a personal story, or whether it's a political story, where is it coming from? Who does it serve? And the second aspect of it is to think about the quality of the story itself. How is what we're being told related to any sense of the underlying reality? At its best, I think a story, when we're talking about not a fiction, I'm talking about an everyday story from life, is based on an attempt to represent some well thought and researched understanding of what the underlying reality might be, accepting the fact that nothing is utterly real. That doesn't mean that everything's the same or that it's all unreal. So a good story, if you like, is something that has consciousness and awareness of the foundation that it's built on. But there are various ways in which that can be subverted or diminished quite subtly. So we see, for example, one of the ways of doing it, and this is very prevalent, is to use euphemisms, to diminish the presence of some element that you want to write out of the story in some way. Or I am thinking of an example of a report about the environmental degradation and species loss. And in the report, even given the purpose of the report, they couldn't bring themselves to talk about the species involved, the bears, the salmon, the wolves, the deer. They would talk about a degradation of biomass, because we could bear that. It's easier to think about a loss of marine biomass than it is to think about the extinction of hundreds of species, extraordinary creatures in the water. And Hannah Arendt, in her classic work, talked about the banality of evil in relation to the Holocaust, the way that Nazi functionaries used euphemistic language. It turned it into a bureaucratic exercise. In a sense, I think, because that's almost the only way human beings can do this. We can dehumanize others in order to oppress them. And you can see that in various things. You could see it in, I'm thinking of the Hutu, the massacres there, where they were talking about cockroaches. So you kind of dehumanize, or you turn people into monsters. So that's one way of kind of diminishing or moving away from truth, is to dehumanize or to diminish or to euphemize things. Another way of doing it is just simply leave them out the story. And if you looked at in the United Kingdom at our television, for example, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you would probably not have thought that there were any black people in our country or any gay people in our country. They were never represented, except in very occasionally as figures of ridicule. So that's a void. You just exclude them. You just write them out the story. And then at its worst, if you like, or most extreme, you've got what Baudrillard calls a simulacrum. This is a free-floating story that has no relationship to underlying reality whatsoever. And a classic example of this is Enron, the energy company that became not an energy company. It became a storytelling factory about the profits it might make if something might happen. And that was represented as being true, but it wasn't. It was complete fiction. It had no relationship to the underlying reality whatsoever. Chris, my late wife, used to talk about a simulacrum as an imitation of something that never existed. And I rather like that.
I like
She
that
says,
too.
think of Disney World. She says, that's a simulacrum. It's an imitation of something that never quite existed. So there are many ways of kind of subverting, degrading story. And then there's another way is to try and control the story. And anytime, whether it's in society or religion or organization, anytime there is only one story that's acceptable, that's fundamentalism. That's a fundamentalist view of life. This is the story, and you better believe it. And if you don't believe it, you're out. Now, there's something I think about: how do we live in and work with and lead with and in a healthy ecosystem of story in which we're seeking to influence that ecosystem? And we can talk about what for, and that's really important. But we have to allow the flow of story. We have to allow the stories to return to us. We have to listen as much as we speak. And we're not listening unless we're willing to be changed by what we hear. So I think I want to get away from a rather tired, cliched notion of leadership and storytelling, which is, if I've got the best story, everyone's going to follow me into the gates of hell. Heroic stories for heroic leadership. That time has come and gone. We're not living in a heroic age. We're living in a post-heroic age. We don't need more of that. We need less of it. I'm saying this as a proposition, of course. Others can choose their own view on it. But I think there is something really important about narrative leadership, which is much to do with listening. Because when I talk about narrative leadership, I talk about these three elements. It's not just telling a good story. It's going back to last week. It's, do you know yourself? Who are you really? What do you stand for? How are you going to show up and be real? What do you care about? What do you bring to the party? Then there's the reaching out. I call that know thyself, after the Delphic Oracle. And then I plagiarize an author to say, only connect, reach out. What are you listening to? I have a little logo of a tree in my company. So the roots are reaching down to know yourself. The branches, twigs and leaves are reaching out into the ecosphere to draw in nourishment from others, to listen. What's the world calling for now? What's needed? And then the trunk is, what do I stand for? And you can't rush that. And sometimes I meet people to say, I just need a good story. And that's not the work I do. Some people may do that. I don't. I want to start with, who are you and what do you care about? What's the world calling for? What's your unique contribution as an organization? Where do they come together? Because that's the sweet spot. That's where it really works. So for me, narrative leadership is about a lot more than telling a good story.
Hold on a second. Go back and just dig a little deeper or expand a little bit on this last part you just said about, I'm going to get it wrong here, but you'll clean me up. Who am I, or what do I stand for? Because you told me a couple of weeks ago that we asked the wrong question. What's my purpose, or something in that vein? And you had a counter to that, and you just said it, but I'd like for you to expand it a little bit, because it's so important, but I don't want to lose it here.
I think, if I recall rightly, our conversation, I made a distinction between the question, how are you, and the question, who are you? How are you is an easy question to answer. Who are you is a much more difficult question to answer. And we have to kind of dig into that a bit to think about, particularly as we become adults and as we move into and through life, we're much better able to reflect and have choices about that. Typically, in midlife, people begin to rethink that naturally. Most people, many people anyway, unless circumstances are so difficult that they don't have the opportunity. But if you have the chance for some reflection and reflexivity, we often do that. this is where I've got to. This is how I'm showing up in the world. Is this the me I want to be? Is this how I want to show up? So one of the ways to think about that is to revisit some of our stories and what are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that shape us in that way. And there are lots of practices around that we can do, inviting people. The little exercise we invited people to do about thinking about their early leadership story was a little taste of that, just dipping a toe into that water. Where am I come from? Who am I? Oh, that's interesting. Is that still true for me? Do I want it to be true? Where did it come from? All those kind of things. And what limiting self-beliefs do I carry? Which ones are nourishing to me? Which ones are healthy and generative? And making some choices, finding some agency there. Then we had to bring that alongside this sense of listening. What's being demanded of me? How broad a vision do I have of the world? What's important there? The life world as much as the system world. How do I want to think about? How far should I look in terms of breadth and time for the impact of what I do? How big is my vision? The Romans created the word ambition, and it doesn't mean how high up the greasy pole. It comes from ambit, ambulare, to walk. For them, ambition was literally how far would you walk around your city to talk to people, to gain influence. And I love this kind of sense of breadth around it.
Well, let's do a couple stories here. You passed on to me a story that I don't really know too much about, the story of Sir David Varney.
Yeah, so I think this is a lovely example of finding this sweet spot between what the person is, who they are, where they come from, what they care about, what the organization contributes, and what is needed. So David Varney, when I met him, he was chairman of what's come known as HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Doesn't sound like much, does it? It was the bringing together of the Customs Authority and the Tax Authority. It was an organization of 100,000 people, pretty big, biggest government department. And he didn't have a background as a civil servant. He'd never worked in government. He'd been very successful in industry. He'd been chairman of various companies and senior executive in others. And frankly, he didn't need any money. He was quite well off enough. But he was offered this job. He applied for and was offered this job as commissioner or chair of this organization. And he came to do with a mission to bring them together, to integrate them and to change the culture. The trouble was, all his folk around him at various levels, including those closest to him, were senior civil servants from a completely different culture. And they didn't get him. He didn't land. He couldn't land. No one understood why he was there. They imputed motives of self-interest to him. He obviously wanted something out of it. We tell that because I was working with a colleague in that business, consulting around narrative and story. And it was obvious he hadn't landed. So we went into his office one day, my colleague Sue and I, and we said, this is a problem. And he kind of acknowledged it. So we said, well, why are you here? And he said, oh, well, I've got quite a lot. I thought I'd give a bit back. We said, no, don't buy that. Why are you really here? And he kind of rocked back in his chair and he's like, actually, I can tell you that. He said, I was brought up in the aftermath of the Second World War. And my parents had no money. My dad was a day labourer on building sites. My mum was a cleaner. And I would come back from school and show my mum my report card. She said, that's really good, Dave, but you could do better, They believed in the possibility of progress, of things getting better. So my favourite thing to do after school was to get on my bike and cycle to whichever building site my dad was on. And if I'd timed it right, we could walk home together. And we lived in London. We walked home through London. And he said, one night we were walking through Docklands. Not the Docklands as we know it now, these temples to Mammon, but literally a bomb site. Craters, piles of rubble, stinking lakes of filthy water, rats. And he stopped me. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, look around, David. It doesn't have to be like this. We can make a country in which there are proper schools, roads and houses and hospitals for everyone. And he said, I've never forgotten that moment. That's the reason I'm here in HMRC, because we're the people who collect the money that make that possible. Now, that night, he told that story at a big dinner in the city. And he added a third dimension to it. He told the story of his dad, why he was there. He referred to what it is, the unique contribution HMRC do is we get the resources to make things happen, not we collect your tax money. And he said, we have a problem. There's a £20 billion gap between what's owed and what's paid. And we're going to close that gap. So he brought together what Marshall Gantz called me, us, and now, or what I sometimes call passion, people, and purpose. He found that sweet spot where those three things came together. And within 12 hours, that story was all over that organization. And he'd arrived. He'd found genuine, authentic grounds to claim a position of leadership in that organization. So that's a lovely example, I think. And he was a very quick study. He was a very bright guy, and he got it, and he saw it, and he could pinpoint it. It was quite a magical moment.
In your book, telling the story, The Heart and Soul of Successful Leadership, you have a line in here that I think is quite provocative and well, let me read it. You say that it's not possible to reach our full potential as leaders or human beings without understanding how story works and how to use them. Okay, so we got a lot of people here who are striving for realizing full potential. So what are you saying there? What's the work for people there?
Let me add another quote to that, which is another one I'll come back to exactly, but this is to the point. So this is a quote which I got from Laura Sims, an American storyteller, and she's got it from somewhere else. So this is what she says. Anthropologist Dr. Francis Harwood, a student of Margaret Mead's, remember Margaret Mead? Once asked a Sioux elder why people tell stories. He answered, in order to become human beings. She asked, aren't we human beings already? He smiled. Not everybody makes it. So for me, there is something about, when I talk about imagination and feeling, I'm talking heart and soul. I'm talking about how if we're only our heads, if we're a head on a stick, and that's a crazy thing to say, but to characterize. But if we overplay our rational selves at the expense of our intuitive feeling self, we lose something. Ian McGilchrist wrote a wonderful book with The Master and His Emissary, in which he says we've got it the wrong way around. The logical mind is a wonderful servant. It's a terrible master. We have to look to heart and soul and imagination and intuition for what really matters in the world. And then we can use our logical, rational self to help bring that about. In that sense, I argue it's true that in order to really fulfill our potential, we have to be willing to embrace both those things. Now, in the system world, heart and soul tend to be considered as less legitimate. I mean, that's a big truism. It's not true everywhere, of course. But there's a better way of saying it would be perhaps that the rational self is lionized. It's given undue prominence. And sometimes it's considered to be enough. And I argue that it just isn't.
I'm with you. As we come to the close here, there's a real life story that you shared with me that I was unaware of about Umicore. So would you share this? Because this, I think, brings together a lot of the bits and pieces that we've discussed the last 2 weeks in a real situation that turned out for good.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't take credit for this. I have worked with the company subsequently. But my friend Richard Olivier, who runs a company that works with Shakespeare and leadership, it's broader than that, but that's one of the things they do, which sounds a bit odd when you think about it, except that there are some wonderful stories to explore. And one of the stories they work with in organizations and leadership is Henry V, classic story of a young man come to take the throne and leading in all sorts of ways, good and ill. But there's a point in the story where the battles are done. And the fifth act of the play is actually about turning the battlefield into a garden. If you look at the language of the fifth act, so much of it is about this best garden in the world. It's turning from war to peace. It's turning from fighting to construction and development and growth. And Richard was working in this company, Umicore, at a senior level with this story as a vehicle to talk about leadership. And it touched the chief exec very deeply. Now, this company at that time was a mining company. They mined all sorts of precious metals, gold and silver, but also some of the rarer metals that we use in all sorts of produce, cadmium and lithium and all sorts of stuff. And they were pretty destructive. If you looked at their portfolio and took photographs, there was strip mining, there was huge degradation around them. And basically he said this, he went away and thought about this a lot, and he came back and talked to the board and then the stakeholders and said, is this the story we want to live? Really? And they realized that they didn't. They wanted to live a different story. And that meant taking really hard-nosed, difficult decisions. So they divested some of their interests. They cleaned up everywhere. So if you look at the photographs before and after this mindset, you'll see sites that have been restored as best as they can. The reintroduction of species and of flora and fauna. And over time, they moved out of mining completely. They're now the world's leading company in recycling of precious metals. Everything they do is recycled. And they have a very clear commitment to what they call zero regrets, net zero, zero harm, zero inequality. It's not been an easy road. It isn't an easy road. There are challenges all the time. But there's an example of, I think, a story that was shaping actions that they began to see into and began to say, we want to shape a different story. We want to, and they had to take, people had devoted lifetimes to particular ways of being in the world. And it was very tough and very hard. But I think it's a wonderful example of how a story can inspire, but also it can be a template for what we want to live into. So they were living into, if we go back to that Ben Okri quote about change the stories we live by, they made a conscious decision to change the story they would live by. And I think it's a wonderful example of leadership and narrative leadership.
All right. So we've given opportunities for a lot of people, other people's stories and points of view to show up in our conversation for the last week and a half, 2 weeks. So the last words are Jeff Mead's words. So I know that you have some thoughts. Let's give you the last word here. Let's do that.
Okay. Well, I'd like to quote myself, if that's all right. My book on storytelling and leadership is called Telling the Story, the Heart and Soul of Successful Leadership. It was the only battle I had with the publishers was insisting on the words heart and soul in the title. And I won that battle eventually after some struggle. But towards the end of the book, the last chapter is called Heart and Soul. If I can go back to Ben Okri, I want to give a Ben Okri quote, then my words. Is that all right?
That's fine.
So this is a quotation at the head of that chapter, which I love, again from Ben Okri. I think that now we need those fictional old bards and fearless storytellers, those seers. We need their magic, their courage, their love and their fire more than ever before. It is precisely in a fractured, broken age that we need mystery and a reawakened sense of wonder. We need to go down to the bottom, to the depths of the heart, and start to live all over again as we have never lived before. The depths of the heart. I wrote after that, heart and soul, feelings and imagination, passion and vision. Is it not strange that passion has become a commonplace word in leadership and business? My office at the time was above a food shop that declares itself to be passionate about pastry. And a leader without vision is considered a laughingstock in business schools. Yet so many writers on leadership are reluctant to acknowledge where passion and vision come from. So let us boldly reclaim these big words, heart and soul, from poetry and pop song lyrics and wishful new age thinking to take their rightful place in our vocabularies. Metaphorically, the heart is the seat of our emotions, while the soul longs for meaning and purpose. They speak a different language from our logico-rational minds. The heart expresses itself through feelings, and the soul deals in symbols and images. Our logical-rational minds are swayed by information and argument, but our hearts and souls are moved by stories and their unique power to stir the feelings and stimulate the imagination of storytellers and their listeners.
Jeff Mead, thank you so much for the last 2 conversations. For me personally, you're talking about how to ride a train, or my story of riding a train with Jeff Mead. It'll stay with me for a long, long time. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Ray. It's been an absolute pleasure, a joy. Yes, thank you. And I hope our connection goes on long beyond these podcasts.
Count on it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to 10,000 Swamp Leaders with Rick Torsett. Please take this moment and hit subscribe to follow more Leadership Swamp conversations.